My name is Erin Collins, and on the day that was supposed to be the start of my new life, my parents made one thing brutally clear: I didn't matter. I stood there in my wedding dress, looking at the two empty chairs that were meant for them. Hours earlier, they had told me not to bother them with updates, because my wedding, my own wedding, was a trivial event. I tried to believe they didn't mean it, that maybe they'd show up anyway. That maybe, just once, I wouldn't be the one standing alone. But when the ceremony ended and everyone else was laughing, hugging, taking pictures, I checked my phone. And there it was, the notification that froze me in place. A new video, a beach, bright blue water, laughter that wasn't meant for me. My family, halfway across the world, celebrating something that had nothing to do with me, on the exact day they had sworn they couldn't make it. I grew up in Fort Wayne, and even as a kid, I understood that my family cared more about appearances than anything else. They loved looking polished, house spotless, lawn trimmed, holiday cards staged like magazine covers. Behind all that shine, the real hierarchy was impossible to ignore. At the top was my older brother, Brandon Collins, followed closely by my parents, Douglas and Marianne Collins, who treated his accomplishments like trophies that proved they'd raised the right child. Somewhere far beneath them was me. I wasn't troubled or rebellious. I just liked different things. While Brandon excelled in sports and academics, I gravitated toward design. I spent hours rearranging my bedroom, sketching layouts, cutting pages from home design magazines I found in waiting rooms. Teachers noticed the creativity I poured into class projects, but at home, it registered as background noise. If Brandon brought home a ribbon, it went straight to a frame. When I received a certificate for a classroom design competition in fourth grade, it ended up in a drawer under a stack of old manuals. My parents' reactions were never harsh. They were dismissive in a way that felt almost casual. A quick nod, a polite, "Good job." Then they pivoted to whatever Brandon was doing next: his baseball practices, his math scores, his future. Even as a child, I sensed that Brandon belonged to their definition of success, and I didn't. Middle school only made the divide clearer. Brandon's trophies filled an entire wall in the den: baseball, debate, science fairs. Every time he won something, Mom hosted a small gathering, inviting neighbors to celebrate. I usually hovered around the edges, helping set out snacks or clean up after. When I won a district-wide interior design challenge for students, I came home excited, clutching a ribbon that represented weeks of work. My parents gave me a soft smile before turning back to a conversation about Brandon's upcoming advanced placement exams. High school amplified everything. Brandon left for college in Chicago, and I thought maybe his absence would open space for me. Instead, my parents spent most evenings recounting his phone updates: new classes, new friends, new opportunities. I tried sharing parts of my life, but the conversation slipped away the moment I opened my mouth. I told them about a guidance counselor encouraging me to study design professionally. They nodded, then asked if I'd heard about Brandon's internship interviews. Still, I pushed myself. I joined a student group that organized school events and poured my energy into making them cohesive and memorable. The prom committee became my favorite place because it was the first room where people actually listened to my ideas. The night of prom, I watched classmates take photos in front of decorations I'd installed with my own hands. Their parents complimented the setup and assumed I'd had adults helping me. I didn't know how to explain that I'd created everything alone in a week of late nights. I kept waiting for my own parents to show up, not to applaud, but at least to see what I'd done. They never came. They were in Chicago that weekend, visiting Brandon's campus. When they returned, they handed me a sweatshirt from his university, as if that counted as inclusion. It felt like a reminder of where their pride truly lived. By the end of 12th grade, I stopped expecting them to ask about my projects or show interest in my future. I understood that Brandon fulfilled their narrative: successful son, stable path, bright prospects. I was the side note. Still, part of me hoped that one achievement, just one, might finally shift something. That chance came in my final semester, when my art and design teacher recommended me for a statewide competition. I entered a model of a reimagined community center, obsessing over every detail. When I won second place, it felt like validation I'd been chasing for years. Teachers congratulated me, classmates clapped, and for a moment, I wondered whether this would be the thing my parents finally saw. When I got home, I found them sitting at the dining table looking through photos Brandon had emailed from a corporate networking event. I waited for a pause before mentioning the award. They looked up, offered a mild smile, then returned to the photos. Dad murmured something about being glad I was keeping busy. Mom said the layout I designed sounded cute. I carried my medal to my room and set it on my desk. The pride I'd felt earlier thinned into something quieter, something closer to resignation. It became clear that I could climb any mountain, win any award, build any dream, and still, it wouldn't measure up to simply being Brandon. That was the moment I realized I'd have to build my life on my own terms, even if the people who should have cared the most never bothered to look. I didn't react. I didn't even breathe. I just kept replaying the moment they told me my wedding was beneath them, a trivial event for someone at the bottom. And suddenly, the empty chairs made perfect sense. And yet, the worst part wasn't the video. It was what happened 1 week later when my father called as if nothing had happened at all, as if skipping my wedding wasn't enough, as if I still owed him something. He didn't ask how the day went. He didn't acknowledge the silence or the hurt. He went straight to his point, cold, direct, entitled. That call changed everything. Before I tell you what he said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now? And where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. College brought a different rhythm to my life, one that felt unfamiliar, but strangely freeing. Moving to Indianapolis meant stepping out of the narrow frame my family kept me in. My days no longer revolved around comparing myself to my brother, and for the first time, my choices felt like they belonged to me. It was the shift I didn't realize I had been craving. During orientation week, I met Chloe Ramirez, who became the first person to treat me like I had something worth listening to. She had an easy confidence, the kind that made people gravitate toward her, but what struck me most was how genuinely she cared about ideas. She asked questions, paid attention, and remembered the details I shared. We fell into an effortless friendship built on shared projects, late-night study sessions, and a mutual eagerness to build something of our own. My design classes challenged me more than anything I had experienced in high school. They demanded clarity, structure, and intention. I poured myself into every assignment, spending hours in the studio rearranging materials, adjusting proportions, and rethinking layouts until something clicked. The effort wasn't about competition. It was about growth. I wasn't trying to match anyone. I was moving toward a future I could actually see myself in. Halfway through my first semester, I met Victoria Lane, the head of a respected interior design studio downtown. She visited as a guest reviewer during a critique session, and while I tried to stay calm, my nerves were obvious. Victoria evaluated my project with a quiet focus that made me feel exposed in a way I didn't expect. When she finished, she offered a nod. Not overenthusiastic, not dismissive, simply attentive. Later that evening, my professor told me Victoria had asked for my portfolio. That request stayed with me for months. Balancing coursework and part-time jobs became a routine. I worked at a small furniture shop near campus, learning how people interacted with spaces they lived in and how choices, small or large, shaped comfort. The job taught me to pay attention to details beyond aesthetics: the creak of a drawer, The heaviness of a handle, the way light stretched across a surface. I discovered that design wasn't about objects, but about how people occupied their environments. That awareness changed how I approached every project. In the midst of all this progress, communication with my family felt increasingly strained. Conversations were short, predictable, and often centered on updates about my brother. Every call ended with me sensing the same invisible wall. They recognized my choices but didn't value them. Even so, I held on to the faint hope that someday they might understand the path I was choosing. I wasn't ready to give up on that possibility. By sophomore year, Chloe and I began collaborating beyond class assignments. We attended local design events and met professionals who offered advice, critiques, and honesty. Networking didn't come naturally to me, but Chloe had a presence that helped both of us navigate the unfamiliar circles. She encouraged me to share my work, pushing me to believe that my ideas deserved space in the world. My portfolio evolved in ways I hadn't expected. Teachers noticed the shift, and their feedback became more specific and challenging. I wasn't the standout student, but I was consistent. I kept showing up, kept improving, kept finding new ways to express what I saw in my mind. That persistence slowly built a confidence I had never felt before. Near the end of my junior year, Victoria Lane offered me a part-time internship at her firm. It felt like a turning point, the moment my effort aligned with opportunity. Walking into her studio for the first time, I felt a surge of excitement that grounded me more than any praise my family had ever given. The atmosphere was fast-paced, filled with sketches pinned to walls, samples scattered across tables, and conversations layered with purpose. I belonged there in a way I hadn't belonged anywhere else. Working under Victoria wasn't easy. She expected discipline, precision, and initiative. She gave feedback that could sting if I wasn't prepared, but every note was actionable. I learned more in those first 3 months at her firm than I had in any classroom. The work expanded my perspective on what design could be and how far I wanted to take it. By senior year, my days were packed with studio projects, internship responsibilities, and freelance tasks I picked up to support myself. It was exhausting, but I carried a sense of forward motion that made the effort worth it. The life I was building didn't depend on anyone's approval, not even my family's. For the first time, that realization felt empowering rather than lonely. College didn't erase the gaps within my family or mend the distance between us, but it gave me something they never had: the ability to imagine a life shaped by my own choices, grounded in the work I loved and the people who saw me for who I was becoming. Life outside college moved faster than I expected, and with that pace came moments that shifted my direction in ways I didn't immediately understand. One of those moments happened during a renovation project I assisted on through my internship, where I met Marcus Reed for the first time. He worked as a project coordinator for the contracting team, and although our roles overlapped only occasionally, he had a steadiness that contrasted the frantic environment around us. It wasn't an overwhelming introduction. It was subtle, the kind of encounter that only grows meaningful in hindsight. At first, he was simply someone who happened to be nearby during long afternoons on site. We exchanged brief observations about layouts, scheduling, or client requests. What stayed with me wasn't anything he said. It was the way he paid attention without needing to dominate a conversation. I wasn't used to that kind of presence. Most people in design fought to be seen or heard. Marcus existed at a calmer frequency, one that allowed space for others. Our paths crossed more often when Victoria Lane assigned me to oversee several design revisions. The changes required constant coordination with Marcus's team, and in those weeks, I saw aspects of him that moved beyond professionalism. He asked questions that centered on understanding rather than challenging. He noticed details that had nothing to do with work. If I skipped lunch, if I stayed too late in the studio, if I seemed overwhelmed. His awareness wasn't intrusive, it was grounding. Eventually, those interactions shifted into meeting outside work hours. We shared dinners squeezed between deadlines, early morning coffees before site visits, quiet walks through neighborhoods we both admired for their architecture. I found myself opening up in ways I rarely allowed. My ambition, my fears, the pressure I carried from years of being overlooked. He took it in without judgment. The more he listened, the more I realized I didn't have to shrink myself to make room for someone else. By the time he suggested we try dating intentionally, the idea felt natural. I didn't need grand gestures or declarations. What mattered was the steadiness he offered and the way he made the world around me feel less chaotic. Being with him didn't erase the gaps I still felt within my family, but it softened the edges. I no longer felt like I was navigating everything alone. As my career matured, opportunities grew. Victoria trusted me with larger responsibilities, and the studio became a second home. I took pride in contributing to projects that shaped how people lived and worked. Marcus supported every milestone, not by celebrating loudly, but by being present in ways my parents had never been. Whenever I shared an accomplishment, he met it with sincerity, rather than comparison. The differences between him and my family became more obvious as our relationship deepened. Around the time we started discussing long-term plans, I decided to tell my parents about him. Their reaction was mild but detached, as though I were giving them a weather update. They asked surface-level questions and moved on quickly to updates about my brother. I didn't expect enthusiastic approval, but the indifference stung more than I admitted. Still, I tried. I wanted them to see the life I was building and the person who had become central to it. I believed that if I kept reaching out, something might eventually shift. It didn't. Conversations stayed shallow, predictable, and centered around the son they'd always prioritized. Marcus noticed the strain those interactions left on me, though I didn't talk about it often. He offered quiet reassurance when I needed it, but he didn't push for explanations. His patience gave me room to process the disconnect on my own. A year later, he proposed during a quiet evening at home. There was no elaborate setting, no dramatic moment, just a soft question delivered with sincerity. I said yes with a sense of clarity that surprised me. The life we were planning felt grounded and real, shaped by choices I made for myself rather than obligations imposed by my family. When I shared the news with my parents, their reaction echoed every pattern of the past. They congratulated me briefly before shifting the focus to Brandon's recent accomplishments. It wasn't the reaction I hoped for, but it felt familiar enough that I didn't let it derail me. I concentrated instead on planning a small wedding that reflected who I was, not who they wanted me to be. As the details came together, the contrast between the life I was creating and the distance within my family grew sharper. What I didn't know then was how much deeper that divide was about to become, and how much their choices would reveal about the place I held in their world. The day of the wedding arrived with a calm that didn't match the weight of what it meant to me. Although the guest list was small and the ceremony intentionally simple, there was a quiet significance in every detail I had helped shape. I wanted the day to reflect the life Marcus and I were choosing, intentional, steady, and built on what mattered rather than what impressed. Still, beneath that clarity, a thread of tension pulled at me as soon as I stepped into the venue. We chose a lakeside space in Indiana that felt intimate without being elaborate. Marcus stood at the center of it, grounded in a way that steadied me instantly. The faces of friends filled the seats, familiar and warm, each one a reminder of how far I had come. But there were two empty chairs at the front, left untouched, unmoved, unacknowledged. I had known they would stay empty, yet seeing them arranged so neatly created a heaviness I couldn't shake. I moved through the ceremony with practiced composure. The moments didn't blur, but they felt quieter than I expected, almost as though a thin layer of distance separated me from everything around me. Marcus's vows softened that distance. His voice carried a sincerity that anchored me, and I held on to that as a way to steady my thoughts. The people who showed up leaned into the celebration with genuine joy, and their energy filled the space my family chose to leave vacant. During the reception, I tried to focus on the rhythm of the afternoon, the laughter that carried across the tables, the conversations that unfolded naturally, the warmth of being surrounded by people who had chosen to be part of my life. Chloe moved through the venue with her camera, capturing moments I knew I would appreciate later. She checked in with me in subtle ways, not with questions, but with brief glances that conveyed understanding without requiring explanation. Still, I couldn't ignore the weight in my chest. It didn't ruin the day, but it sat beneath everything, shaping the edges of every emotion. I knew I wasn't supposed to think about the people who weren't there, yet my mind kept drifting in that direction no matter how deeply I tried to stay grounded in the moment. Near the end of the evening, after the last dance and the final round of goodbyes, I slipped away for a moment of quiet. The air outside carried a coolness that contrasted with the warmth inside the reception hall. I reached for my phone without thinking, almost out of habit, hoping for something, anything, that resembled acknowledgement. Maybe a message saying they hoped it went well, maybe a missed call, maybe even silence that felt neutral instead of pointed. What I found instead was a notification that felt like a punch. My mother had posted a new video online. The thumbnail alone told me everything. White sand, turquoise water, bright sunlight. I tapped it anyway, as if some part of me needed to see the truth clearly rather than imagine it. The video showed my parents and my brother's family walking along a shoreline in the Maldives. Laughter filled the background, carefree and unburdened. They looked relaxed, glowing even, wrapped in a kind of joy that felt intentionally separate from anything involving me. The caption described their trip as a celebration of family, a word that left a hollow echo in my chest. The timing, the tone, the ease of it didn't feel coincidental. It felt deliberate. I watched the video twice, not out of disbelief, but because the finality of it settled slowly. There was nothing hidden between the lines. They had chosen to be somewhere else on the day I had hoped they would stand with me. They had celebrated openly, joyfully, and publicly, while I walked down an aisle with 2 empty chairs at the front. The contrast was sharp enough to make my throat tighten, though the tears I expected didn't come. I slipped my phone into my bag and returned to the venue, holding myself steady. Marcus was finishing a conversation when he noticed me. He didn't ask what I had seen. He simply moved to stand beside me with the kind of presence that didn't require explanation. His quiet support wrapped around me in a way that eased the tension I carried. Later, when we left the venue and stepped into the stillness of the night, I felt the weight of the day settle fully. Our wedding had been beautiful in all the ways that mattered, but the emptiness my family created lingered. Their absence wasn't surprising. What hurt was how easily they celebrated elsewhere, as though the day meant nothing to them, as though I had never been part of their definition of family at all. A week passed before anything shifted again, though the weight of the wedding day stayed with me in quiet, persistent ways. I expected silence from my parents, and for several days, that's exactly what I got. I tried to settle back into a routine, organizing the gifts, putting away decorations, catching up on work I had paused, but the heaviness didn't fade. Nothing felt wrong exactly. It just felt unfinished. One quiet afternoon, as Marcus and I were sorting through a few remaining boxes, my phone lit up with an incoming call. The name on the screen stopped me cold. I hesitated long enough for Marcus to glance over, and before I could decide what to do, the call went to voicemail. A moment later, another call appeared. This time, I answered, partly out of instinct and partly because ignoring it felt like avoiding something inevitable. My father's voice was clipped, controlled, and emptied of anything that resembled warmth. There was no mention of the ceremony, No hint of acknowledgement, not even a question about how I was doing. He moved directly to what he claimed was the purpose of the call, a financial matter he believed required my attention. He told me there was an outstanding loan associated with my college expenses that had fallen behind, and that he and my mother needed me to handle the payments immediately. His tone wasn't accusatory, but it carried an expectation that made my stomach tighten. I knew my financial records well. I had taken pride in paying off every part of my education on my own. Hearing him imply otherwise triggered a dull pressure behind my eyes. The way he framed the situation made it sound as though I had neglected some obligation to the family, as if I had created a burden he and my mother were now forced to shoulder. The call was brief. He ended it with the same tone he began with: formal, distant, transactional. After hanging up, I stood still for several seconds, unable to process the mix of disbelief and tension running through me. Marcus approached quietly, giving me enough space to collect myself before asking if I was all right. I didn't offer details, only that I needed to check something. I pulled out every folder containing my financial records. Page after page confirmed what I already knew. Every loan tied to my education had been fully resolved. Nothing was pending. Nothing had been delayed. The numbers were clean, precise, in order. There was no missing payment, no oversight. The certainty of that fact sharpened my confusion into something firmer, something bordering on anger. Once the reality settled, I stepped into another room to call my father back. He didn't seem surprised to hear from me, nor did he acknowledge the contradiction between his claim and the truth. He shifted the explanation subtly, suggesting it was less about the loan itself and more about supporting family responsibilities, a phrase that only deepened my frustration. He referenced obligations, upcoming expenses, and expectations, none of which had anything to do with me, my life, or my choices. The conversation ended with a clarity I hadn't anticipated. His priorities weren't hidden or complicated. They were simply not aligned with mine. In that moment, something sharp inside me loosened. I responded calmly, telling him not to contact me about trivial matters, and ended the call before he could continue. The silence afterward felt heavier than anger, but cleaner, too, like a line had finally been drawn. That evening, I found myself unable to shake the lingering heaviness. The issue wasn't the money. It was the disregard embedded in every part of the exchange. It was the realization that even after everything, my father viewed me as a resource, not a daughter. Marcus stayed close without pressing for details, offering presence rather than questions. The next morning, I scheduled an appointment with Dr. Naomi Clark, a therapist I had been referred to months earlier but hadn't yet contacted. Meeting her in person brought a steadiness I didn't expect. She listened without interruption as I recounted the call, the emotions it stirred, and the years that had led to that moment. Her calm observations cut through the confusion with a precision that made the situation clearer. She told me that boundaries weren't walls, but choices. Choices about what behavior I allowed and what relationships I invested in. She suggested writing a formal message to outline those boundaries, not as an act of confrontation, but as a way to reclaim agency. Her guidance wasn't forceful, it was grounding. That night, I drafted the message she encouraged me to send. Marcus sat beside me, not to influence my words, but to offer quiet reassurance. Chloe later stopped by, her presence familiar and steady, leaving room for me to decide what I needed. Their support formed a buffer around the uncertainty I felt, giving me the strength to confront what had become undeniable. Once the message was complete, I read it through one final time. It was concise, firm, and unmistakably clear. Without hesitating further, I sent it and set my phone aside. The decision felt heavy, but for the first time in a long time, the weight belonged to something I had chosen rather than something that had been placed on me. In the days that followed, a different kind of quiet settled over my life. It wasn't the tense silence I had grown up with. This one felt deliberate, like a space I had finally allowed myself to breathe in. After sending the message that drew the final boundary, I kept waiting for a shift inside me, some sudden release or burst of relief. But what came instead was a slow, steady lightness that grew more noticeable with each morning. The absence of contact didn't surprise me. What did surprise me was how quickly the pressure I'd carried for years began to dissolve. I hadn't realized how much mental space I had given to hoping for change, rehearsing conversations, bracing for disappointment. Without those things filling my mind, new thoughts finally had room to form. I started thinking more about my career, about the designs I wanted to create, about small projects I'd put off. My focus felt clearer, sharper, anchored by something steadier than the pursuit of validation. Marcus and I spent more time together in uncomplicated ways, cooking dinner, planning weekend trips, choosing paint colors for the guest room. Nothing dramatic, nothing heavy, just the kind of ordinary moments I used to watch other families have and wonder why they felt so out of reach. Now they felt natural, even grounding. He never asked for details about the boundary I had set. He simply supported the decision, trusting me to know what I needed. Chloe stopped by one evening with a basket of pastries and a set of colored pencils she thought I would like. She didn't pry, and I didn't offer explanations. She just sat with me at the dining table while I tested each pencil on a sketch pad, the two of us drifting between conversation and comfortable silence. It struck me that this was what connection was supposed to feel like: unforced, mutual, steady. Work became a refuge again, not an escape. My ideas flowed with a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. I took on a new project, a rebranding campaign for a local nonprofit, and poured myself into it with a level of confidence that startled even me. For the first time, I wasn't designing to prove something to anyone. I was doing it because I loved it, because it made me feel capable and alive. As the campaign came together, I realized how profoundly the shift in my personal life had affected my creativity. With less emotional noise in the background, my thoughts had room to stretch. I found myself experimenting more, trusting my instincts, and letting my perspective guide the work instead of second-guessing every choice. Dr. Clark helped me process the deeper layers of this change. In our sessions, she guided me through the parts of my childhood I had avoided naming, helping me see that distance wasn't abandonment, it was self-preservation. She reminded me that letting go wasn't a failure, it was clarity. She pushed me to consider what I wanted my life to look like moving forward, not in contrast to the past, but independent of it. The more we talked, the easier it became to see my parents' absence as a consequence of their choices, not a reflection of my worth. Their priorities had shaped my childhood, but they didn't have to shape the rest of my life. Understanding that distinction felt like rewriting a piece of my identity, quietly, firmly, without bitterness. News about my parents reached me indirectly through extended relatives who still kept in touch. I didn't seek updates, but they surfaced anyway. I learned that some family members distanced themselves from my parents after hearing about the way they handled my wedding and the financial fabrication. My brother's in-laws questioned their behavior, and tension formed where my parents least expected it. These weren't outcomes I celebrated, but they were reminders that actions carry weight, and that accountability doesn't always arrive loudly. None of it changed my decision. I didn't want revenge, reconciliation, or explanations. What I wanted was peace. And for the first time, I truly had it. As months passed, I grew into the space I had created. I started decorating my home with framed prints of my own artwork, a small gesture that once felt presumptuous, but now felt deserved. I found joy in routines I used to rush through. I stopped apologizing for the boundaries I needed. I stopped shrinking to fit expectations that were never meant for me. And somewhere along the way, the grief softened into something else. acceptance, maybe even gratitude. Not for the hurt, but for the clarity it forced me to find. Standing in my living room one evening, watching the sunset spill across the walls, I realized something simple but profound. Family isn't determined by blood. It's determined by presence, respect, and the willingness to show up. Marcus, Chloe, the people who stood beside me, they were my family long before I had the courage to admit it. If you're listening to my story, maybe you've felt something similar. Maybe you've carried the weight of someone else's expectations, or waited for approval that never came. If so, I hope my experience gives you permission to choose yourself, to step toward the life you want, instead of the one someone else built around you. You deserve that freedom. You deserve that peace. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. And if you've ever faced something like this, I'd love to hear your story too. Your voice matters here.